Professor Tine Vekemans. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Hopefully, okay.
Right.
All right. So I'll start with reading her bio a little bit, and then she can take over. So Professor Tine Vekemans holds the prestigious Ācārya Mahāprajña Chair for Jain Studies at Ghent University, also in Belgium. Her work on contemporary Jainism and Jainism outside of South Asia combines textual and anthropological methods and approaches Jainism from the day-to-day experiences and practices of Jains. Her courses include modern history of South Asia, society and current affairs of South Asia, and specialist seminars on migration, modernity, contemporary Jainism, and Jain texts in Hindi and Gujarati. That's quite enormous areas to cover. So all yours, Professor. Welcome again.
Thank you very much. I'll just see if I can share my screen as it should be shared.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Right from the start.
Yes,
okay. So thank you very much, Professor Jain. It's lovely to be here. We've been spending a couple of days on the campus of Flame, and we've been enjoying the tranquility a lot. It does indeed make room for thought and work and writing, and luckily also for presenting. So I wanted to start very briefly by telling you a little bit more about my approach to Jain studies, as Eva and I are close colleagues and share sort of our Sanskrit teachers, and Eva taught me some Prakrit as well. But my approach to Jainism is much less literature and text centered than Professor de Klerk, than Eva's is. I work mainly on contemporary Jainism, and the basis of my research so far has always really been ethnographic. I start from the experience and the practices of Jains themselves, and now in approaching Jain migration history, the memories of Jains and Jain families, rather than from doctrine or text. That is not to say that text isn't present in my research at all, as you will see in today's presentation. So these are my two most recent publications. Digital and Diaspora is a book based on my PhD research, which came out of Ergon, and then earlier this year, a chapter appeared in Living Folk Religions, a volume by Routledge. And it's in an interesting way connects to my talk today. So if you're interested in the concept of Jain mendicants and mendicant-like figures being present outside of South Asia, then I will direct you to this volume where you can read my encounters with a sadhu that came for lunch in Atlanta, and which puzzled me greatly. And puzzlement and kind of not understanding a situation can be really powerful, sort of in coming to an understanding, can be a really powerful methodological moment. Right. Before I get started with my talk of today, I want to recognize the input of some of my colleagues and friends. The text that I will be reading from today was found in a manuscript collection by Professor John Kort, who just had time to take a picture of the first page before he had to leave. Then Eric Villalobos, currently at Emory University, went back to scan the entire thing, for which we're very thankful, and is also here today, I think. He also sort of talked me through the type of mendicant the author of this text is. So I'm leaning very heavily on his work. And then you have some people based in East Africa, in Kenya mostly, like Pushpendra Shah, who is the person in charge of a large Facebook group called the Oshville Memory Project, and people based in London, such as Hashmita Shah, who you see in the picture, and Professor Atul Shah, who actually gave a talk for Flame earlier this year on Indic finance, together with Devendra Jain, Professor Devendra Jain, with whom I have an ongoing Jain migration history project. The title of my talk, as announced, is "Oh Maharaj, Take These Lemons." It's supposed to be a little bit of a puzzling title. I will, in the coming half hour, 45 minutes, I will talk you through these lemons, and by the end, I hope you will know what I'm talking about. It has two subtitles by now, it keeps on growing. Jains and Jainism in East Africa, but also a singularly interesting source text to learn about them. So let's jump in and try to figure out more about these lemons. With me stood a crowd of brothers and sisters who related their experiences of the sea by way of advice to me. "Oh, Maharaj, take these lemons with you, because the sea gets very choppy." "Okay," I said in reply. Another said, "Yes, Maharaj, the food on the steamers is good at times, but not always. Fruit is good for this." I listened to everyone's advice. Amidst congratulations and well wishes, I proceeded to finalize formalities and was guided to the dock to board the steamer. Our passports were checked and our pictures taken. But security was less tight than we had expected. Perhaps our white robes caused the officials at the dock some surprise, and they dared not disturb us. Indeed, at 6 o'clock, we stepped onto the stairs of the steamer. On the one hand, I was going abroad for the propagation of religion. On the other, the enthusiasm of the crowd at the dock was like the motherland calling me back. As I boarded the steamer, I was conflicted. My heart was beating with the echoes of various futures, and my mind was restless. Everything I read is an English translation which I made from a Gujarati original, and I am so very much to blame if there's any inaccuracies or problems with the translation. I just need to add that kind of as a reminder. So, what am I reading from? I am reading from a travelogue consisting of more than 400 pages in Gujarati, which was published in 1952 by a Jain organization in Gujarat. These 400 pages consist of some preliminary chapters, which are really quite sort of more in sort of the philosophy of culture, the philosophy of civilization, and then the philosophy of religion, called Light and Darkness, and then the currents of culture. It's interesting to see that this combines kind of a state of affairs of Jainism and of where the Jain society should be at this point in time when it is written, but it also more broadly thinks of ancient civilizations such as the one in India, but one in Mesopotamia and Egypt is also mentioned, and how they have fared throughout world history. So it's a really very broad introduction to what is essentially sort of the culture and civilization in the Western Indian Ocean. The travelogue then continues with accounts of some travels that the author did within India, to Malabar, to Kutch, and then comes to a Chaturmas passed in Karachi in 1945. The slide says it's actually 1944. I'm sorry for this inaccuracy. And then the next chapters give an account of travels to Aden and Addis Ababa, and then travels to the British East African territories, and then Uganda and other countries. If we put that on a map, we can see the most important locations which are mentioned in a travelogue. The light green ones in India, and what was British India, Karachi is now in Pakistan, of course, they're the main points of focus in India. Bombay, where the steamers leave, 2 steamers in this story, one to Aden and that Gulf of Aden region, and one to East Africa. Karachi, where the invitation to travel arrives, and Porbandar, which is where the Jain Sangh, the Jain organization is, which will eventually then publish this book. We see that in this first trip, Aden is the main location because the invitation comes from the Aden Shri Sangh, but Djibouti in Ethiopia, Abyssinia, as it is referred to in travelogue, are also visited. In the second trip, Mombasa is the first port of call because that is where the initial invitation came from. But the author actually visits locations in Kenya, in Uganda, which isn't really even on the map. I couldn't make it work. But also Tanzania and Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar. So it is quite a busy schedule. These days, Eva and I sometimes complain about how busy our days are in our 2.5-week trip to India, but they are perhaps nothing like as busy as the days of this author, who does this sort of 2 trips within a span of 11 months. What does he write about leaving and sort of the sense of going abroad? Familiar society has become accustomed to listening to sermons, meaning that they understand the practice of it. They do not take time to implement the sermon when it is done. While the unfamiliar society listens eagerly to the sermon, thinks carefully, and tries its best to implement it. This is why I've always accepted invitations from unfamiliar places. Who is this person writing? Who is this person sort of reminiscing and thinking about different audiences to give lectures to preach to, and the reaction of different audiences? The author is Yati Hemchandra, who is a member of a Yati lineage within the broader Lonka Gach, which sort of came to the fore in the 16th century. We don't have an exact date of birth or date of death. We do have an exact date for his Diksha under Yati Swarup Chandra, which was done in April 1939. Now we know that this Yati Hemchandra, the author of the book that I am reading from to you, is a Gurubai of another Yati, Yati Raj Chandra, who interestingly is one of the very few, if not only other, that we know of that have traveled outside of South Asia in that kind of time. Yati Raj Chandra went to the other side, so not East Africa, but Southeast Asia. And I'm looking into finding dates and more details on those travels as well. Yati Hemchandra was quite influential. He was quite influential giving speeches around time of independence as well, so religious but also political speeches. And he became the administrative head of the lineage after his guru Swarup Chandra died. So what's Yati? Some people will know, others might not. I spent a considerable time studying Jainism from a contemporary perspective without ever sort of encountering this category. But Yatis dominated Shvetambar Jainism in the early modern period, especially in Gujarat and Marwar, Rajasthan region. And they are mendicants. Often the title Yati and title Sadhu were used interchangeably, but Yatis are sort of, if anything makes them special, it's an alternative interpretation of the Jain monastic code. They take the 5 vows of a traditional Jain mendicant, but they are known to travel by vehicle, handle money, and engage in some cases in practical sciences like astrology, Ayurvedic medicine, and mantra making. Now I say in some cases because in the case of Yati Hemchandra, there's no indication that he really spends time on this kind of activities, but we'll get to that later. Now, from the 19th century, there's been some reforms in both the lay and mendicant Jain communities, and they have, by the mid-20th century, so by the time that we encounter Yati Hemchandra and he travels, these lineages are kind of almost at their end. They are nearly eliminated, not entirely though, and that is where Eric's research comes in. There are still some pockets, some lineages, some families of Yatis about, but as a tradition, as sort of fully initiated Yatis sitting on a gadi, on a sort of Yati seat, that is nearly completely eliminated and was already much in decline by the time Yati Hemchandra writes. So that makes this travelogue also very interesting from the point of view of the history of reform and counter-reform in Jainism, especially sort of Jainism of mendicants, ascetic Jainism, in that mid-20th century. And in the travelogue, we read about our Yati encountering others. I'll read to you again. I spoke to him directly. Him, in this case, is a sadhu that he meets in Karachi, where he's spending his Chaturmas. Telling him that if he was willing, I would like to give a lecture with him. And before he writes this. He said that this is a sadhu that he heard a lot about, and that is apparently a great scholar of languages. So he's actually looking forward. From his writing, you get the impression he's looking forward to this. But the response I got from him, he writes, was, "You are not worthy to lecture with us." I was sad. This was not worthy of a scholar of virtue, but a spectre of pride. When I asked why they looked at me with such hatred, the answer was, "We know Yatis. In Marwar, you people have spread much deception." When hearing this answer, I ceased making any further pleas or requests from this Muni. The Yati Sampradaya of Marwar, he writes a little bit later, has fallen out of favor with the public today. Gujarati Yatis, which is the kind of group that he is part of, should take care not to represent the mendicant values, should take care to represent the mendicant values of modesty and knowledge. On many occasions, such monks have undertaken to interrupt my lectures, but I will not go into that now, as I am unsure if I will even call them monks. It can be quite sharp in his writing. But for myself, I'm satisfied, and I don't deceive or try to make myself look special. I consider myself blessed. I'm a Yati, I behave like a Yati. If I were to do the work of Yati in the guise of a sadhu, and then he means a Samvegi sadhu, his criticism would apply. But as I do not, it doesn't. From this text, you clearly see that there's different groups involved. Hemchandra writes as a Gujarati Yati. And he gets into this, not really an argument, there's clearly tension between him and this Samvegi sadhu, this what we now would call sort of the traditional sadhu. There's clearly a tension based on the Samvegi sadhu saying Yatis, they are lax, they get into all of these kind of tantric behaviors which aren't worthy of a true mendicant. From his side, Hemchandra clearly sort of looks at the Samvegi sadhus and says, well, look at this pride, which isn't really worthy of Jain mendicant. Look at how they embrace sectarianism rather than approach the world from sort of a non-sectarian viewpoint. But then you also see, although in the travelogue he doesn't encounter any Yatis from Marwar, he has sort of heard the sadhu's comments about the laxity and about sort of the tantric meddling of Yatis, and says, well, but they're the ones from Marwar. And for him, clearly that sort of, they're bad publicity. And we will see later on that he could not steer more clear from mantra making and tantra and sort of healing activities if he tried, right? So he clearly distances himself from that. But we'll come back to the ideology that is clearly present in the travelogue later. First, I want to read to you guys some more from the text. I want to read to you how Yati Hemchandra gets an invitation to go and embark upon this quite impressive travel around the Western Indian Ocean. One day, a householder came to me and asked, Maharaj, would you come to Mombasa? I was surprised. Mombasa? For a Jain Yati, this is indeed a matter of wonder, and I well understood what such an endeavor would mean. Going to Africa means crossing the ocean. But I was thrilled at the thought that the type of work that I'd been doing within India could be spread to Africa. The benefits I have received through listening to your lectures could also greatly benefit our Gujarati brothers who have settled there. And if you do not provide these brothers of ours living far away with such benefit, the word in Gujarati is labh, who will? That householder was Sri Bhagwanji Hansraj, the leading activist of the All Africa Mombasa Sri Svetambar Deravasi Sangh. And the only picture I could find of him is actually a picture which is in the snack and sweet shop of his family even today in East Africa. So with that, the invitation has been delivered, and Yati Hemchandra describes how he starts looking at his options, how he tries to come to a decision of what to do. Because indeed, even though Yatis are known to have traveled by car, by train, by all kinds of transport, in 1944, when this invitation comes, crossing the ocean, boarding a steamer, still seems like a very, very unusual thing to do, even for them. But then also from the beginning, like he says, you read from the text, he wants to go. He wants to take them up on this invitation. He's already in previous chapters described how he feels that travel to lesser known regions within India, to Kutch, to Malabar, has greatly sort of expanded his horizon, and he finds it very satisfying and a very sort of a learning experience. So he writes, what's the current status of Jainism? What was once the religion of crores, today is not even that of lakhs. And how many cracks have appeared even within these lakhs? There is nothing left but cracks and strife between groups and subgroups, which has disintegrated the strength of the Jain society. I shuddered as I realized it all. How unreligious has the society that worships the non-violence of Mahavir become? Thoughts came to me and my mind began to spin. What would be the condition of the Jaina living far away? What will be the circumstances of the Shravaks in the world across the ocean, who have lived there for years? I wanted to see it all myself, but what would society say? So he ponders this, but in the end, he's in Karachi, he has to give lectures, and in the evening he goes to bed, and he hopes, I would assume, to have a good night's rest. But alas, this will not happen, because he has a very interesting dream in which a specter appears in his room and talks to him. What is the problem? Says this specter, says this ghost. I have traveled 3 times. I lectured as an expert on Pali languages at universities in Europe, and along with that, Jainism was propagated. The society there developed a curiosity about Jain philosophy. I converted many carnivores to vegetarianism and softened the hearts of the bloodthirsty, so spreading the glow of the lamp of knowledge far and wide as it should be. I have presented to the world the precious knowledge which Mahavir gave to the world. I've broken the old system and abolished customs, and have spread the religion abroad. So what is stopping you? So no rest for Yati Himchandra that night. The spectre that visits him is Pandit Jinvijayji speaking. Now, Pandit Jinvijayji was a former monk who renounced mendicancy and set sail by sea in 1928 to different locations, but mostly to Europe. And he then went into education in Gujarat and other places. But in another place, in the travelogue, he, meaning the author, speaks more about Pandit Jinvijayji. How the Jain community was in uproar when he left. People denounced his decision and even tried to prevent it. However, this opposition was caused by a lack of true understanding and a clinging to narrow personal beliefs. Discounting all that, Panditji traveled abroad, and let me tell you, if he had had the full support of our fortunate society, he would have been able to spread Jain literature, culture, and philosophy much more widely still. But society has always misunderstood such people, and it still does. And in the sharpness of how he writes this, you feel that he knows that he's going to encounter opposition, both within sort of lay society, and he's going to get backlash from parts of that mendicant society as well. He anticipates this. But still, he is quite clearly adamant about his decision. And on September 24th in 46, he boards the steamer for a second time. This time he already went to Aden. How he goes to Aden before Mombasa, I'll briefly tell you. It has everything to do with geopolitics at the time. So the Mombasa invitation comes first. And the fact that he accepts after conferring with his guru, also sort of the word of that spreads as well. But to go to Mombasa, there's visa formalities that needs to be taken care of, and they take quite a while. Now, before his visa to Mombasa can actually be delivered, the Jain Sangh in Aden has learned of the fact that a mendicant has said yes to an invitation to preach overseas. So they extend an invitation, and because Aden, not at that time, but until less than 10 years before, was actually governed as part of the Mumbai presidency. The visa formalities were much less stringent. So he actually ends up going to Aden while waiting for his visa to Mombasa. He boards the steamer a second time and crosses the ocean a second time in September 46. And this is how he arrives in East Africa. When they woke up in the morning, everyone was trying to catch a glimpse of Kilindi Harbor in the distance. When I woke up, I too remembered that we would reach Mombasa today, and I too tried to see our destination from within the cabin. It was drizzling outside, and in the dim light, the buildings and the harbor front appeared within my sight. Along with my brother, who's traveling with one other yati, I started to pack. At 6 in the morning, the steamer moored at Kilindi Harbor, and I felt the cables being stretched. At the harbor, the leader and members of the Sri Stanakwasi Jain Sangh were present to welcome me. It was raining heavily, but this did not seem to burden the hearts of the people. Indeed, I was very happy to see many brothers and sisters on this occasion. As soon as I put my feet on solid ground, the celebration started. So I'll briefly present the communities he visits and how they developed in the places that they did. So Jains and other Indian communities have been present in East Africa for a good long while. But for most of history, almost all migration around that Western Indian Ocean was circular migration, meaning that people involved in trade would venture out Persian Gulf, Gulf of Aden, East Africa in one season, and then come back carrying other goods back to India a few months later, depending on the monsoon winds and currents. In the 19th century, this starts to change, the pattern changes, and we see more and more pockets of settled migration, and the number of people settling, so number of people from India settling around this Western Indian Ocean also increases. Now, why does this change? This has to do with modes of transport and availability of alternative modes of transport, so alternative to the dhow. But it also has a lot to do with colonialism and empire. Because we see that on the other side, so the non-Indian side of the Western Indian Ocean, the British gain more and more territory, more and more colonies, which they seek to build up and, it's colonialism, exploit, right? So Aden becomes theirs quite early, even under the East Indian Company, and is then, as I said, under the Bombay Presidency until 1937, governed directly from there. So it's governed as a part of British India for the longest time. Zanzibar becomes a British protectorate in 1890, closely followed by the East African Protectorate, which will become Kenya in 1995, the Protectorate of Uganda even 1 year earlier in 1994. And then Tanganyika was first German East Africa, but after the First World War, or during the First World War, comes under British influence in 1916. So because of this, because it's all kind of part of this British Empire, groups of people move. Let me try to kind of give you a bit of a structured view of this. So you have British and other European settlers in these East African protectorates, more and more. You have an emerging local economy, but to the sentiment of the British, this emerging local economy needs help. It needs people with a head for business to come in and sort of help make this into a sort of a monetary economy rather than an economy of barter, which is a process that in India had begun much earlier, and so they know how to work with these Indian traders. There's also a lot of indentured labor. indentured labor. The British have abolished formal slavery, but they've thought of this system, which other colonial nations also use, of kind of usually 5-year contracts, which brings mostly Indian laborers to these other colonies, to plantations as far as Mauritius and Fiji, but also and in force to East Africa to construct infrastructure like railways, roads, etc. Now, some of these indentured laborers stay and settle in the place that they initially came to work temporarily. And this is also quite a sizable group. And together, these European settlers, this local economy, these indentured laborers, and these post-indentured settlers make up quite an interesting sort of market. And it is this market, this group of people with demands for food and utensils and everything, which also really accelerates independent migration to these East African protectorates. And it's in this independent migration that we need to look for the Jains. Not necessarily that they come as very rich businessmen, but they do migrate to East Africa, mostly to set up businesses to cater to this newly emerged markets that they are actually quite well placed to cater to, because they know of the cultural background of these indentured laborers and post-indentured settlers, and they are more used than the local African communities to dealing with the British and the Europeans. So this picture is a picture of indentured laborers working on the lunatic line, which was the Mombasa-Kampala railway line, which was constructed and finalized around 1900. About 32,000 Indian laborers worked on that. It cost the lives of at least 2,500, because it was truly a lunatic project through deep jungle with a lot of lions, etc. But this kind of explains how there's a big Indian community in East Africa, and the reason why Jain traders also increasingly went there and migrate in a more settled way. Now, if we look at how these communities develop, it's really, I mean, and this won't be a big surprise to many of you, it kind of follows a pattern of sorts. Mainly, first, a sentinel migrant is sent out by a family, or sometimes we have accounts of an entire village sort of chipping in to buy a ticket for one of their own to go and set up a business. And then in the second wave, when this business is successful, which often it is, but sometimes it isn't, we also have cases of these sentinel migrants just coming back, having to save up money to be able to come back to India. When there's some success, the second wave of migration follows, and then usually it's a brother or a nephew or someone else of the village coming to join this business. So it grows quite gradually at first. The first Jains that we know of to be in East Africa are just at the end of the 19th century, and a few more coming in the beginning of the 20th. And then the growth is quite gradual until sort of the interbellum, let's say. And then we see more movement, more things happening. Now, why do we see more things happening? Because as this group, which is initially gender-wise quite male, because they're the traders, they're the ones conducting the business, this group grows and realizes that they are there for a longer period of time. It doesn't necessarily have to be forever, ever in their minds at that time, but that they will lead a more or less settled life there. Wives come into the picture. Children are brought up. You see here in the picture the family of Keshevji Parbat, who arrived in Kenya in 1905 as one of the first. His family picture in the 40s, this says circa 1940, but with the amount of grandchildren in the picture, that can't really check out. So it's probably a little bit later. It's probably around the time that the author of our travelogue travels there. Anyway, you see children that have been born to these Jain communities in East Africa. And the moment you have not only the traders focused on their business, but also the families, the wives, the children having to sort of have some upbringing and some notion of sort of cultural background, religious values, community organizations emerge rather rapidly. And with community organizations comes in a slightly later phase, infrastructure. Infrastructure meaning temples, but also cultural centers, Mahajanwadis, schools are set up as these businesses are more and more successful, and as these communities become more wealthy, they develop their own educational infrastructure, their own medical infrastructure, sports infrastructure, etc., etc., etc. In the travelogue, we read about the type of people that the Yati Hemchandra encounters, and just very general, he about Mombasa says there's Kuchis, there's Kathiawaris, and there's Gujaratis. And on the whole, we can actually say that for East Africa, the first migration, mainly to Zanzibar, is mainly from Kutch. Then Kathiawar, and then the Gujaratis. The Gujaratis arrive slightly later than these other groups. But by the time he travels, these are the three communities that he finds. There's also an Indian association of which they are part, and a Mahila Mandal too. The Jain Derasar of Mumbai is a Tiert for the Ravasi brothers living in East Africa. Apart from this, there is the Jain Gyanvardhan Vadak Mandal. But it is the Vanik society that is most organized and flexible and organizes Jainism-related activities for the whole Jain society. And then the Vanik society is mostly the Oshwal society, because the majority of Jains then in Mombasa comes from the Oshwal groups from Gujarat. Around Jamnagar. And there's also sort of a smaller Navnat group, which kind of groups other people from that region which do not come from the traditional Oshwal villages. This is probably, someone will be able to nuance this, but that is probably the shortest way to conceptualize this. The travelogue is really interesting because it gives an insight to these communities as they are in full development just after the Second World War. A lot of migration during the World War, things were sort of at a standstill, but a lot of migrations coming in just at the end of the World War and just after. These communities are in full development, organizations are in full development. And it's really interesting to read in detail about how many people are where in which villages, what organizations do what kind of events. It's extra interesting because it's very rare to find information specifically on Jain communities in these places at that time. It's also really interesting because we know that less than 20 years after the Yati's visit, after the situation that described to us, everything changes. Shifts and a decline of this community is kind of imminent, if you can call it imminent, if there's 20 years to go. The Zanzibar revolution will come, the Aden emergency and then Aden independence will mean the practical end of the Jain community there. The situation in Kenya is going to be difficult throughout the Mau Mau rebellion and the Africanization policies that follow independence. Tanzania will see its socialist reforms and its own brand of Africanization. And then probably the most dire of them all in 1972, the expulsion of South Asians from Uganda by Idi Amin will end the Jain community there for at least 20 years. Now, today, there's again Jains in Uganda, but they are not the same Jains that were there before. In the picture, you see the Sri Kuchi Svetamba Jain temple in Stone Town, Zanzibar, often claimed to be the oldest Jain temple outside of South Asia, but the one in Aden is actually older, but when it was built, it was part of the sort of British India, so it counts and it doesn't count. Either way, this is one of the temples which has a claim to be the oldest, built in 1905. Interestingly, because we're talking about these shifts and the decline of these communities, the Zanzibar revolution kind of ended the Jain community in Zanzibar. And they took the statues, the murtis from this temple, first to Dar es Salaam and then to Nairobi. The community in Zanzibar at that time kind of reconfigured a little bit, merged with the community in Dar es Salaam. But then a few years later, with the reforms in post-independence Tanzania, again, sort of, it didn't disappear, but it was decimated and has definitely changed very much since then. Another picture here, you see a Mahajanvadi Hall in Mbale. It was inaugurated in 1961. But 11 years later, in 1972, when all of the South Asians had to leave Uganda, it was nationalized and was then turned into a school. So this new hall, which was inaugurated with a lot of sort of pride and a lot of happiness, existed for exactly 11 years before everything changed. Right. So after 1972, you see a complete change and a reconfiguration. I'm not going to go into details because I will go over time quite horribly, but it's good to know that, for example, the Jain community in London is the vast majority of them have an East African connection. So this story of Jains in East Africa that I tell now from a point of view of the mid-20th century is still very much relevant in the practices and in the way and in the family histories of Jains in other places in the world today. Also in the travelogue, we see the welcome letter that the Sri Visa Oswald Vanik Society gives to the Yati upon his arrival in Mombasa. Not going to read it to you because, again, not enough time. But one of the things I say is, well, clearly here in East Africa, we haven't been able to follow Jainism sort of completely as we should, but we hope that you coming here will set us on the right path, and we are very dedicated to do so. So from this letter, from sort of this idea that, okay, we need your expertise, we need your engagement because we need to be led down the right path, it makes us wonder, what exactly does this Yati Hemchandraji preach? And that's the last thing I will talk to you guys about. It's interesting to see what ideology is in the travelogue. So remember this triad of the Samvegi Sadhus, the Gujarati Yatis and the Marwari Yatis, with sort of mentions of laxity and tantra and allegations of sectarianism and pride on the other side, right? And also remember that we're in the 1940s, world affairs, things are changing rapidly. The invitation comes to the Yati during World War II. He travels just after World War II. We are at that point 1 year before Indian independence. Also, in other places in the world, sort of the struggles for independence and anti-colonial nationalism are on the rise. So things are happening fast. We also see after World War II, this sort of the pre-formation of the Cold War with these two power blocks in the world, communism on one side and the West, and sort of the gradual rise of American power on the other side. So all of that is at the background. And what does then Yati preach? He actually does not go into Jain doctrine much at all. He talks to these communities about non-sectarian Jainism with an emphasis that couldn't be further away from Tantra, from this allegation of Jains meddling in Tantra that he heard from the Samvegi Sadhus. He emphasizes knowledge and social action. The word humanism is probably the most prevalent word in the entire travelogue, and interfaith collaborations. He makes a point of always mentioning the fact that he also is invited very cordially to Muslim homes, to Hindu families, that he also interacts with the local Swahili population. So that is very strongly present, and that is very clearly kind of also a reaction to this this triad he has going on with the Samvegi Sadhus and the Yatis. Then you also have clear references to independence movements, both in India, of course, very strongly, in Gandhi, but also independence movements going on in other places in the world. So the broader anti-colonialism is quite present there, as is sort of this appeal for solidarity between these colonies and to help each other figure out ways to get back to independence and to get back the values of these ancient civilizations, especially around the Western Indian Ocean. He shares a cabin on the second steamer with a person called Jomo Kenyatta, who will be the first president of independent Kenya, which is a lovely coincidence and very interesting, because they discuss the merits of Marxism and Gandhian nationalism. And it's very clear throughout the travelogue that there are nods to socialism and Marxism, not necessarily that Yatiham Chandra himself preaches over Marxism or socialism, but he does let Jomo Kenyatta tell his story and kind of talk up the merits of communism without really going against him. So these are another few excerpts. Let me see how badly I'm going over time. But he talks about the lust for empire that grows and the sting of selfishness fell on the world. Human civilizations were destroyed for status and profit. The selfishness of man undermined culture, and the entire world got caught up in this current. So it's, again, this gives you an idea of, it's very eloquently written, quite strong, and not just on the level of let's get the British out, but on the level of how to think of culture, civilization, and the passing of time. Anti-sectarianism is very present. He, of course, writes, but when he travels, he is invited to Gandhi Jayanti celebrations, but Gandhi is still alive at that time. But by the time he writes about these Gandhi Jayanti celebrations he attends in Nairobi, I think, Gandhi has been assassinated. And there he writes, we should not be swept away in the stream of sectarianism and lose our sense of humanity. There we are again with the humanism and humanity. Just because we believe our principles are true and beautiful does not mean we should impose them. And at the same time, we should learn to cultivate moral courage so that if something seems to be true, we can accept it. Even though it may be a truth that shatters our preconceived notions. Truth is hard to contemplate, digest, and embrace, but only this is the right way to live. I'm going to skip this to get to the conclusion, and also because I want to read you a last excerpt before we conclude. So in conclusion, I'm just very happy to share these glimpses of ongoing research with you guys. So I don't have a broad conclusion yet. I'm in the middle of this and I'm very excited to read and learn more. But what I can say is that we see in this travelogue a unique intersection of events. We're in kind of the final decline of the Yati order, but still we see this narrative which is presented very strongly. We get an idea of this developing Jain diaspora in the 40s, which is really when the diaspora as we know it now got going. We see these independence movements on both sides of the Western Indian Ocean, and we see different anti-colonial ideologies, some more communist inclined, some more sort of cultural nationalist inclined. We see them interwoven in this tale. It's also interesting to link this to ongoing concerns about mendicants traveling, about sort of the essence of the role of the mendicant in Jainism. Is there a need for outreach to lay populations? Should Jain mendicants be present in the world like this, or should they focus on their own individual spiritual progress, which from certain perspectives is the essence of being a mendicant? That is why you do it. You retreat from the world, then why go out in it? And it is also really one of the only sources to study Jainism in East Africa before the 1950s. So as sort of a closing statement, I want to read you one last bit of this travelogue where, and it's one of the instances where we see that Jain doctrine and moksha does every so often enter into the story. Above was the sky and below was the sea. In between the two, our steamer crossed. Near the shore, the water had been yellow and dirty, but here the currents were crystal black. I gazed at them before heading to my cabin for a long rest. The steamer rocked and made us sway, and the swaying also brought us peace. I lay in bed, and the waves of my thoughts rose in my mind like the waves of the sea. Isn't the world just like the ocean? It is infinite, it has storms and tempests, and our lives are being propelled by its turns. As the steamer is dry, so our soul is dry, and it too must cross the ocean and visit the different ports along its shores to finally reach the peaceful place of its final destination and enter the kingdom of moksha. But what if the steamer goes down in a sudden storm along the way? What if the soul gets stranded in this life? Can the steamer take the same way back? And how long will the journey take? Can anyone really make it to the other shore? I closed my eyes. I fell asleep with the sea rocking me like a small child. And that is where I will leave it. Thank you very much for bearing with me through my excitement about this ongoing project.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful, really innovative. We never heard so many details of African Jains or Jains. Not only Kenya had some Jains. I think Kanji Swami had gone to Kenya and there was a temple.
Yeah, he did in 1980. It's the only overseas visit he did.
So much we learned today. Thank you so much. We have a hand raised by Mr. Siddharth Shahi. So let's see what he has to ask or mention. Oh, yeah, Siddharth. Go ahead, please. Siddharth Shahi. His hand is still up. Okay. Meanwhile, anybody else would like to ask or comment? Welcome to ask here. Meanwhile, you can tell us more. How many countries in Africa today have Jain temples?
Today there's quite a few Jain temples. So Mombasa, they built one in the 60s. Well, let me start. So they got a first building built early on in the 20s where they could gather and they had a small temple, but it wasn't a Shikarbandi temple. It wasn't an Indian style temple. Now in the 60s, they built the first one, Shvetambar Deravasi. And then in the 80s, they built a new one. And the one that is now usually sort of referred to as the Mombasa temple is the one that was built in the 80s. There is one in Nairobi as well, also from the early 80s, if I'm not much mistaken. The temple in Zanzibar is still there, and I hope to visit it early next year. It is not a day-to-day functioning temple, but the Dar es Salaam Jain Sangh actually goes there, I think on 2 occasions for festivals to do some pujas and to have some events there. So it is, you can visit it, but it's not so that there's no daily puja going on. That's also Shvetambar temple. So the Digambar temple there is not in Zanzibar. There's definitely one in Mombasa, and there's also one in Nairobi. I would have to look into the dates for that, but it's quite late because the Digambar group there was quite small until Kanji Swami came. Well, not till he came there, but until Kanji Swami and his reform movement became more popular in Gujarat. And from then you see that there's more and more sort of Digambar Jains identifying with this Digambar ideology in East Africa. So a lot of them actually internally converted from sort of being Shvetambar Oswals to Digambar Oswals, to these Mumukshus following Kanji Swami. And then in Kampala, in Uganda, you had a temple which was no more after 72, so all of that was nationalized. I'm assuming that there's probably a place of worship there now, but again, Jains only came back to Kampala in the 90s, so I'm not entirely sure of that. Dar es Salaam has temples as well, probably a Shvetambar and Digambar. And then there's community halls, the Mahanjawadis are dotted around the place. So even quite small villages in Kenya, as soon as there were sort of 5-6 families, they would try to set up a hall, because on the whole, these communities did really well. So they did become from quite humble beginnings. They did become quite wealthy, and then this is one of the things that they would invest in, and that they would try to construct. So, like the one in Mbale in Uganda that we saw in the picture, that's a small community. I think there were only 150 Jains there, but still they sort of got up to building this and sort of gathering money for this to have a place where they could meet.
Okay. Anybody else? Any other question from anyone else?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Siddharth has typed his question. Okay.
Wait, let me see. Okay, I'm wondering if this is more a question for Eva. Differentiation within the Ramayana in Hinduism and Jainism, with Jainism being a pant and not a religion in itself. Okay, I can sort of I can talk about this, but I think it's more a question for Eva. So if Eva is still here.
Okay, so talking about Jain temples, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So I've been to Europe and some parts of the Oriental nations, basically, and stayed in Gujarat or and I've been to a lot of their answers. So, what do you think about the sculpture and the architecture difference, which you see, like the impact of Oriental countries on the Jain architecture, as well as the sculpture out there in the Malaysian and Singaporean side, as well as the European impact on the Derasars you see in Europe and
Yeah. Okay, that's a really interesting question. I must say I haven't been to Malaysia or Singapore myself. We have a PhD student who will leave in 5 days from Belgium to go and explore Jainism in Southeast Asia. So I'll get back to you when next we meet. I will have an opinion about this. But about Europe and the US, I can sort of talk about this a little bit. So you have different things. When Jains first sort of started coming to, for example, the UK in a larger group, people didn't really think about building like a traditional Jain temple. So they would just try to get a building. In Leicester, for example, in the UK, it's a church. It's a former church to house a temple in. So there you see it's very clearly Western architecture, but on the inside, the most sort of sculpture, etc., is imported from India. So you have nods to traditional architecture without it actually the building being at all Jain or Indic or anything really. But then as these communities grow, and especially if they're quite wealthy, you do find sort of this urge to get more traditional buildings going on. And you also see that in the newer temples, so from the 60s and the 80s in East Africa, that they're built usually sort of to the example of the temples that are found in Gujarat and the south of Rajasthan. The one in Antwerp, for example, is actually it's 12th to 13th century Gujarati temple, white marble. It just is. It has very few nods to European influence. It's very clearly sort of thought through. They want to be as close to traditional temple architecture as they can, and you see that in some places in the US as well. It just really depends on how wealthy a community is, and also how how sort of the internal demographics are. So it's very clear in Antwerp, this is a predominantly Gujarati community. It's a diamond community. They have a lot of money. They went for as traditional as we can get, Gujarati style mandir.
Right.
But if you have a community which has more Jains from Karnataka, for example, and a mix of Rajasthani and Gujarati, then it becomes more of a challenge to figure out what exactly you want to build. So the Oswald Center Temple in in London, for example, is also quite a traditional temple. Also, although they have decided to add a lift, add an elevator, but it's sort of in the red sandstone building material that you see. It's not the white marble. In Antwerp, they really very clearly went for the white marble. And in the US, where these communities are usually more diverse, you see that the building is pretty much standard Western, but there is a love to make it shikarbandi. So you often have like a Western building style box house, really, with then the shikar on top.
Right.
I don't know if that answers your questions. These were some of my thoughts.
Right.
Okay, any other question from anybody else? If not, yeah, Sanjay. Go ahead, Sanjay.
Yeah, I hope I have not missed this part, but I was wondering, in Hindus, we have this notion of, or rather, we had this notion of purity and pollution when one crosses the ocean or the seas. So I was wondering whether this kind of notion was there amongst the Jain mendicants also.
Oh, it's definitely there. So if you look at sort of Jain doctrine, it's very difficult to pinpoint it. It's not necessarily in those texts, but it is kind of this trepidation, this idea of not to cross the black water, right? Is definitely, it's culturally there, right? Without wanting to go into the discussion whether Jainism is a separate tradition or sort of part of Hinduism, which was referred to in Siddharth's other question. It's definitely there. It's culturally there. This is the black water, right? Both for mendicants and for lay people. And now mendicants traditionally wouldn't travel by a mechanical means, so they wouldn't get on a boat anyway. So it's these yattis, and then later on from the 70s, some individual mendicants starting to make an exception. But usually they wouldn't travel at all. So then it's less of an issue because they would their vows wouldn't allow them anyway. But even for lay people, it's a big step. It's a big step, and then for Jains, it's not necessarily framed in sort of purity, impurity, but it's just very practically, how are you going to do your daily rituals? How are you going to keep to a strict Jain vegetarian diet if you're going to go do this? But for the people who left from Kutch, and definitely the ones from Gujarat, they left at a time when the monsoon had not been good. They weren't really doing great. The situation there, something had to give. At the very least, there was not a lot of opportunity for the younger generations to really do anything. So making that step was necessary. And if you look at individual like autobiographies and accounts of people that actually left, it's very much framed as an adventure. The thoughts of what are you going to do, and purity, and what are you going to eat, they're there in the accounts of the mothers they leave behind, and of sort of the village leaders that say, be careful. But in the minds of these people that are going to be these pioneering immigrants there, it's very much an adventure, and it's also very much a necessity. They weren't that well off when they left. And in many cases, in 1 or 2 generations, they turned it around completely. They became really wealthy, and they were one of the communities that very early on went all out for education. They educate both their sons and their daughters, sent everyone to universities in London and back to Mumbai and all that. So it was a gamble. There was a lot of trepidation there, but it needed to be done. And it was also very much an adventure.
So I think this also brings us back to the question of lemons, because they didn't have anything to eat, and so the lemons were there.
Lemons.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Anything else? Anybody else? I think that's it. So, Sanjay, you can take care of the closing now.
Okay, sure. So firstly, thank you all for joining us on this incredible journey. Thank you, Professors Eva, Professor Tine. This was a very enlightening way of knowing about the Jain history, and especially for someone like me, who is not a scholar of Jain history, but still I got to know so many things through this webinar. And thank you, Professor Pankaj Jain, for organizing this webinar. And so thank you, everyone. See you. Bye.